we have a question from Judy White. Judy is a member of the Flat Bay Band, Assistant Deputy Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Reconciliation, Chairperson of the NL Human Rights Commission, and as of January 2022, co-chair Indigenous for Equal Voice, Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think, here we go.
My question is, we see the persistence of discriminatory barriers faced by members of equity-seeking groups, including women, members of racialized minorities, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous people. How can we address these issues of critical race, anti-racism, while allowing space for us all to thrive and survive?
Survive and thrive. Let's talk about that. Who wants to address that question?
I can go ahead, Leila. We have to address it, I believe, in our education system. We have to start teaching our children about the real history, not just what was written by the victors. We have to explain how systemic racism has really formed our country of Canada. And we also have to make space for people of color, Indigenous people. And we have to do that in boardrooms, we have to do that on committees, we have to do that everywhere. And to that end, I'm going to stop speaking now.
Mm-hmm.
I heard a great quote actually recently when it talks about making space. It's one thing to make space at the table, but if power isn't also given, it then becomes tokenism. And I think that is a really powerful when we're talking about how to create places where we're addressing anti-racism and critical race and making sure that people of marginalized communities are able to thrive and survive. I think for a long time, it has been on these marginalized communities to fight for their space at the table, to fight for their voices to be heard. And I think it's a little bit more time for our white counterparts, those who have had the option of when they choose to fight and how much they choose to fight, to actually carry some of that weight too. Because for so long, it has been on these communities to fight and to struggle and to build these spaces for themselves. And that weight is really heavy. That weight is draining on these communities. And we're doing a lot more surviving than thriving when the weight is on us. And if we're trying to get to a point where marginalized communities and marginalized people are able to thrive while we're addressing anti-racism and critical race, our white counterparts need to put themselves on the front lines. They need to be the ones willing to bear a majority of that weight and willing to not so much lose freedoms, but lose spaces at tables where they have been so comfortable and share power. And that's a hard thing for people to do because no one really likes to share power, but sharing power so it's no longer tokenism for marginalized people at tables is where that needs to happen. And doing it, and as Lynn said, our education system is one that really needs to take a look at that. But for boardrooms are a very big place for that as well.
And I think we are now, would Mary weighed in on that last question, or Lynn?
I can just briefly jump in there as well, because the points have been made and very good points. And I acknowledge that. I think we need to roll up our sleeves as people in leadership positions, especially white people in leadership positions, and make space and get in the trenches and do that work as well, because the struggle is all of ours. And the one thing around Indigenous struggles for sure is that we define feminism and activism sometimes as a point in time when capitalism started and unions were formed and women became involved in the workforce in the 1930s. But Indigenous women have been doing this work for a lot longer than the 1930s, and their stories sometimes are missing from our history. So as we educate our own members and our own selves about why this is so important and why this work is so important, because advancing those rights will advance the rights of all workers and all women. But unless we advance all our rights, none of us will have that equality. So we need to make sure that we include that for the Indigenous, especially Indigenous women who've been leaders on these lands for a long time, and their contributions to our activism and how they've actually helped shape how we struggle for that equality as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, I was just going to pop in and say that everything I wanted to say, Laura Bell said. I'm so pleased. I think it's so important. I think right now we're at a place where people are slowly starting to recognize just how much work that Indigenous people and Black people and other people of color have done over decades and decades and decades to kind of get us to the point. I don't think it should be on our shoulders anymore. I think this is now, we really need to get to a point where, settlers, white people are doing the work themselves. They can do it. They can learn. I trust you guys. You got this. You can take it from here. I don't think educating, educating settlers is it can be such a burden on other people. And I recognize the fact that as a very white presenting Inuk woman, it's a bit grayer, but I think the time has really come. Look in your own communities, chat with your families. That's, this is where you have to just do the work, do the discussions, figure out which cousins are supporting the convoy. How do you get to them? At this point, that's not on marginalized communities to sort them out. Sort your own relatives out, right? That's yeah. I'll end it there.
Do the work.
Do the work.
Excellent.